Another draft physics presentation. Yes, I'm talking some more. So anyway, some general ideas, some thoughts and stuff. So I won't make these an official kind of video. Just make it a comment video of sorts. So eventually I'll get to some comments, maybe. We'll see how much I talk. So I was doing some, thinking, and I was thinking about the two-slit experiment, and whether it's been done in different circumstances, and namely in a vacuum with light, not electrons, and whether it's been done, say, underwater, in different mediums. Because I was thinking about the fact that the atmosphere could have some play in this in some way or another. The fact that we don't really think about it, but air is kind of a transmission medium. It's transparent. It's like really thin glass or something. I don't know how to, it's a substance. It's not a nothing. It's a something. And it is kind of, although not really thick like water or like glass, dense. It's still pretty dense because it creates a lot of air pressure that keeps things together. So I got to me thinking about vacuums, and I've always had some questions about vacuums and how they're created and what the exact mechanism is of this idea of creating an absence of pressure and trying to pull things out of where they are based on the fact that they're under pressure and they want to escape the high pressure they're in. And what exactly a neutral pressure would be, that is the absence of pressure. And what that would mean to electrons and protons, which might be nothing. What it might even mean to an atom that's floating about and not feeling any pressure. Not feeling irritable. And that would mean it would have to be very cold, because heat is an irritant to atoms, makes them move. So anytime you had any temperature at all, you have some pressure. So in theory, stuff is always going to migrate, in a sense, from hot places to cold places. Cold is a vacuum of a kind, of a sort. And so anyway, there's lots of stuff to think about. So anyway, I was doing some research, and I didn't get very far. I'm looking for, two slits in space or in a vacuum, and didn't find anything. Just speculation. People do the math where they make assumptions, but there's no actual sighting to an actual experiment done. I mean, I'm sure somebody must have put a laser and two slits inside of a vacuum bell and done the experiment. It seems like somebody must have. But the problem is most of those vacuum things are round, and so technically you couldn't really shoot the laser through the glass, because the glass is going to distort the beam. So you'd have to have something more optically correct to transmit your image enough distance to get enough resolution to see the pattern. So there's different technical problems, but still should have been done. And I thought underwater should have been done, like in a fish tank or something. Can't find anything. But again, lots of people doing the math. It's just saying, well, light has a smaller frequency underwater, so therefore they just do the math based on the change in the wavelength. But they don't have any data demonstrating that that's what actually happens underwater, which it does seem kind of curious that there's nothing. So anyway, looking under space, I did find a listing for a Miles Mathis paper and read it on the two-slit. And his theory is similar to mine in that he's citing a more mechanical cause, but he's essentially creating a new particle of some kind of EMF that's not regular EMF, some sort of smaller than a photon kind of energy that is interfering with itself in terms of the two sides of the slits, or interfering with each other and creating the interference pattern in between the slits, and therefore the photons are just being obedient to the pattern already created by the interference of this force. And clearly I'm saying something quite similar in the sense that there's force that forces electrons and protons into positions, but that I think all the evidence points to the fact that photons only, in any way that we know, interact with something the size of an electron or bigger. That there's not any force smaller, any entity smaller, that can affect a photon. Can't just bend one. That electrons don't bend them, they actually absorb them and readmit them. And I don't think there's any evidence of anything else. If somebody has it, I'd be interested in hearing it, but I haven't seen any evidence in my exposure to physics that indicates photons can be manipulated by any force, any EMF or anything at all. They're just not bendable, except for their argument about gravity. And obviously that's an experiment, because of the speed of light and the weakness of gravity. It's an experiment you just can't do. And you depend on the cosmos producing the evidence. And as I've pointed out, that evidence has so much contradiction in it, and the fact that the evidence isn't what it should be. There's a piece of the right evidence, and there's a huge giant pile of stuff that should be that isn't. We don't see that should be there if it were true. So the theory has no consistency in the evidence record. It's actually a huge inconsistency. And of course that's not paid any attention to by people, but that's sort of an important fact. When you have a theory and only one tiny portion of the evidence matches it, and the bulk of the evidence is contrary, that should be an indication that your theory is probably incorrect. But me saying that right there, I've violated some sacred rule of, don't pull the curtain back and show the man behind the curtain. I mean, don't expose the truth, and don't talk about the truth as these are fundamental premise, presumptions, and assumptions of physics, and they're assumptions based on very tattered evidence, very weak and flawed and unsubstantial, broken, not good evidence. And they just mock the idea that this should be about evidence, and that this should be a reasoned argument, made through a careful and considered evaluation of the evidence. And it just isn't there. Like I said, there's no evidence of this two-slit experiment done in all these ways that might provide a little bit of an indication of what actually is happening. So here's an image that almost looks like it might be on the subject, but it's not. So there really isn't anything. There's some nice images in here, but none of them have anything to do with light diffraction underwater, and specifically the two-slit experiment. And I'm not saying there should be a change. I'm just saying it'd be nice to see the actual experiment performed, so there could be some sort of conclusions drawn about whether the only thing that happens is there is this true wavelength change, and that the pattern is narrower, and that there's some sort of actual evidence of that change. I mean, I might speculate that water, because it's a different medium, will be, not only does it have a different diffraction index, but that there would be a different, almost like you could almost say the way soap covers a loop of wire, and that you can make a bubble out of it. There's mechanical things that can be caused because of these changes in the tension of mediums. So you might suspect that two slits underwater might be different than two slits in the air, because the medium between the slits is now different. There's different kinds of atoms, and they can create different kinds of patterns or tension or geometry that could change the pattern. And that this might just be refraction. This just might be a distortion in a medium. Might be. Again, I would say I have pretty low confidence that the two-slit experiment would be actually different if you conducted it in space, but I'm just not sure, because I really think it's about electrons. And I guess the point of this whole argument is that when I think about vacuums, you can't really vacuum electrons. It's hard to do. They're certainly going to be affected by heat, so they're going to be agitated by heat. So again, the likelihood is they're going to migrate to a cool environment if you can create one. But how do you create one cold enough, so to speak, empty enough? And just the whole thoughts on that. How do you do this creation of a real vacuum for subatomic particles? Because you can't, you can pull electrons out of something by, tying a proton to a string or something, and you could pull the protons out, and as you pull the protons out, the electrons will come out with them. You can think of some way of making a glue for electrons to pull them out, but they get pretty hard to persuade once they're in an environment that's not too harassing. They're not going to necessarily need to jump out of where they are. They're not going to be knocked about enough to create enough interactions for them to spread in a direction. There's just not going to be enough pressure between them for them to repel. And there's going to be the advantage of there might be more protons in an environment where there might be more heat. There might also be more protons in such an environment, and more reason for the electrons to hang around. So they might be, until you create an environment that somehow is proton heavy, electrically important, they're just not going to have the energy, the impetus to move from the environment they're in to another environment. So anyway, I just thought about vacuum pumps and different things, and I was wondering if anybody ever put a vacuum pump inside of a vacuum, just to measure how much pressure just the vacuum pump itself creates. So I probably should draw a picture of that. So we'll just scale down some more of this stuff. So the other thing that's sort of related is the dissident science guy, Dave D. Hilster. He's made another video saying he doesn't think charge is a real phenomenon. He thinks it's arbitrary. And there's just so much evidence of charge being a real phenomenon, just like there's the real phenomenon of magnetism. So in a way, in my opinion, to deny the existence of charge is to deny the existence of magnetism in a way. And it's such a fundamental physical phenomenon that I don't think you can describe any model of reality that doesn't include it as a phenomenon. You can replace the word magnetism with something else if you want. Polar bear. But you need something. You have to explain it. It's a real phenomenon. There's real evidence of it. You can't just say it's arbitrary, that they just somehow made up a discussion about a nothing when there's clearly a something. So, I won't bother playing this video, get into a thing, but yes, it's just this whole idea of the dissident science thing. I just don't think it works in the sense of how I would do it. If all the dissidents want to be a collective and do something supportive for each other, then they ought to make one kind of argument collectively, and then in their own time they can make their own personal conversations about what they believe and why they believe it. But their objective should be to point out how conventional science isn't as solid as they presume it to be, that there's plenty of elements of their whole theory that can be that are worthy, that deserve scrutiny, because they're not only extraordinarily bizarre, they're completely under-proven by evidence. And there should be harsh challenges to the assumptions made in science generally. And that should be our common purpose. But as soon as he starts talking, to creationists, and then he starts talking about how the expanding Earth is a real theory, and then he starts saying things like there's no such thing as charge, and then defending it by saying I have a particle theory that somehow doesn't need it. Well, you do need it. You have to explain the phenomenon, and your theory doesn't do it. And so that's sort of what I was saying about Miles Mathis is, yes, I think there's a mechanical explanation. He does a very good job of articulating how their explanation, the Copenhagen interpretation and this other stuff is too incomplete a theory, and it's not consistent, and so he does a good job of explaining how their nonsense is nonsensical. But then his replacement theory is too superficial and too also incomplete in terms of, it makes you say, well then why, if there's particles that can actually move light or bend it or do this, then why don't we create these particles in experiments to deliberately bend light? Why do we have to, couldn't we improve fiber optics or some other kind of mechanism if we didn't have to rely on light actually reflecting off of material objects? If we could move light by just creating a force field to bend it through, well, why wouldn't we do that? So it just makes you wonder, if there's such a thing, then why can't we use that thing in some deliberate way instead of just saying it only is accidentally created when you make slits? That's not a very deep explanation. So there's, half the argument there is to like, in sense of the critique that their answer isn't much of an answer, but his answer is a little too thin too. I'd certainly say my answer is a lot heavier, as coherent and consistent with the evidence, and it doesn't make new particles, which is good. So anyway, and I think a lot of the problems some of these dissidents run into is they can see how their answer is too just made up as a god, but it's like the pre-evolution time period of mankind where without a solid evidence for evolution, it's really hard to just walk up to people and say 400 years ago that all the organisms are evolved from one organism, and that we are kind of descendant from a variety of ape that existed millions of years ago, and it all sounds kind of wacky that the earth is 4 billion years old, that life's been evolving for 1 billion years, that's hard for people to swallow without some sort of evidence. So yeah, we're at a huge disadvantage in terms of using these mechanical models because they're so used to non-mechanical models. And the problem is this is all stuff that's so small, it's really hard to collect your evidence for a theory. And it's all based on premises. So again, that's part of the problem. I've even run into it myself in the last few years doing this, is that I kind of want to accept their word for it on some of the functions of matter. I say, okay, yeah, the model of the atom with the electron orbiting, and my brain said, yeah, that makes sense. But when I start thinking about it in terms of what actually can fit, it doesn't make sense in a lot of ways. It never really did to me. The idea of a shared electron that's always moving, that doesn't sound like a very good sharing mechanism. If it's only here 1 millionth of the time, a tiny percentage of the time, it only exists here in this location a tiny percent of the time, and yet that's supposed to keep another atom interested in this electron when it's not here most of the time. That doesn't sound too logical. If it's going to be shared, it seems to me it's got to be staying in a region that's shareable. So the Bohr model just doesn't, in my opinion, work. And then you think about it and you say, well, do I have to accept the Bohr model? What's the evidence for it? And then you start looking at the evidence, and there isn't much. So again, it was kind of an assumption. They just kind of had a little bit of data and said, okay, and then it was sort of consistent, the model, but there really wasn't any hard proof. And even in cases like the Einstein case with gravitational lensing, It sounds okay as theory. Oh, yeah, that sounds possible. Photons have a mass. Yeah, maybe they can be deflected. Doesn't sound too rational to say they can't be sped up by gravity and they can't be slowed down by gravity. That doesn't sound quite right. I mean, if they can move left to right, why can't they be moved forward and back? So that's not very consistent. But so you can find little problems, but you say, generally speaking, okay, I get that. But then when you look at the actual, everybody just jumps on the bandwagon. Everybody says that's the way it is. And then when you look at the actual evidence, the Eddington experiment and stuff, you say, gee, the evidence is terribly weak, so preposterously thin, and it has these huge problems, like these huge liabilities. The model doesn't really match, because if you run the model in other circumstances, it's not working the same way, the same expectations. The lenses aren't working. They're only doing one thing a lens does, and everything else the lens is supposed to do, they're not doing. They're really broken lenses, and you can't have it both ways. So sometimes it's just this hype, and the hype just becomes the truth. And in gravitational lensing, I don't think it was anybody's fault necessarily, but it just became this easy to believe assumption, and it's never been really proven. And the Bohr model is the same way. It's just an assumption based on very little evidence and a few correlations. Like, it sort of makes sense, but it has all kinds of problems when you really think about it and you really go through the details, and it just probably isn't right. And so anyway, but yes, you try to construct your model that's consistent with these things you think are legitimate axioms of the science, and they're not really legitimate. They've never really been demonstrated to be proven. As with interference, the evidence exists. There's some indication that there's a thing called interference because there's a pattern, but what's causing the interference? As Malmassus would describe it, the interference is a function of the environment, and the light's just passing through a pattern that already exists, and it's just duplicating the pattern that exists in the atmosphere. And I'm sort of making a similar argument, except it's not interference of any kind. It's just the fact that electrons happen to move in specific angular ways, in quantized amounts of movement, and so that's why it's a periodic pattern, is because electrons are periodic. They have what you could call a resonant frequency, harmonics. So that was another thing I thought about, was lasers and harmonics of photons, and that sort of gets to the pressure argument in terms of when you move two electrons together, and how the vibrations between the electrons will eventually become in phase, because the electrons are vibrating, changing the distance just subtly, and as they change that distance, they force anything that's out of phase to eventually get the same beat, and so it all has the same beat eventually. So it takes things that are different and over time turns them into a consistent kind of orbit, a consistent wobble, a consistent procession, how the best to say it, but it blends them into a beat. So that's a whole interesting subject, and how much time that takes. And it always takes a little bit of time, and that's sort of the problem. The flaw with lasers is that in theory they can start beating, but the problem is they're constantly creating new photons, and the ones that haven't been in the stream long enough don't pick up the beat, and they might be ejected from the laser before they've acquired the beat. So there's a noise in the laser. There's light out of phase. Yeah, so anyway, just some interesting thoughts, and the fact that they're just, for foundational theories, you'd think there'd be a little more work done in physics to shore up these axioms. a little more work done in having some real hard case professionals, some experts like in court, have some experts look at the evidence of lensing in an objective way and detail whether it makes any sense. You know, go through all the physics and say, is it really possible to have a lens that's 500 light years across and yet it produces no other aberration but these two little fuzzy galaxies on the edges, this little blue shifted stuff, blue shifted to boot, you know, without an explanation for why are the lensed images blue shifted, and why, how can it be possible that nothing else is in the way of that lens? No dust flies by and gets magnified. How is it possible that there's absolutely nothing else in the field of view of that lens? And likewise with the two slit, it'd be nice if a university took 6 months and really beat the experiment to pieces. You know, manipulated it in all kinds of ways, froze it and put it under water, put it in a vacuum, do this, do that, do anything, everything possible to see if you can create some aberration, some evidence that there's might be something else going on here. And there's just none of that really happens in physics. It's all individuals. There's no theme, there's no guidance above physics saying, well, this is the part where we're weak, this is the part where we don't have enough stuff done, so yes, there's a $50 prize if you can do some work this way, and another prize to do some work over here. We need to shore this up. There's no organization, and everybody's just kind of going their own way, and there's no real incentive to shore up the foundational physics. Then there's huge incentive to make a headline somehow by, you know, actually finding some unicorn poo. You know, even though it's just a hologram of poo you created in a synthesized experiment based on a bunch of assumptions you never proved. You know, I don't know whether anybody's ever really tested a polarized filter to see if the same 50 is whether it truly blocks 50-50. Has anybody ever done the test? So yeah, I wish I had a lab. I wish I could direct, you know, people to take the time to do these experiments, and I certainly on my own can't do all of this stuff. So I have to try to, you know, try to use my time as best I can to do what I, you know, need to do for my purposes, which is not only to prove the current physical theory to be weakly founded in terms of weak evidence it's built on, and extraordinarily bizarre in terms of its far from simple answers to the simple problems, which seems the intuitive way to go. Try to find the simpler answer, not the more complex answer, and it doesn't have any appearance of that. And clearly support my own thought process in terms of finding those simple mechanisms like the polarized quanta theory that allows for the creation of things like charge and magnetism, you know, the most fundamental of the forces, the ones that are most dominant in how physics functions. And clearly I see a great deal of usefulness, you know, in exploring that mechanical theory, because it has all the elements of a right answer, the correct answer. It fits the evidence so well. So I guess to the drawing table, I think. You know, see how that goes. So I don't know how much of it's necessary in terms of, you know, but the idea of this vacuum thing. So I was thinking of, you know, in space, so you'd have a cylinder. I could draw the cylinder in a different color. So you have this solid object, you know, made out of steel or something, and you have a cylinder inside here, you know, that you're going to move in and out, and you have a sealed container here. And the question that I sort of ponder is okay, there's always a problem in creating the gap here is always a space where you're vulnerable to stuff getting in, polluting your perfect vacuum. So when you have this cylinder all the way closed and then you pull it back, so you're basically saying you have nothing. You have metal against metal. There's nothing there, just some electrons at best. And then you pull the cylinder back and expose empty space. Now, you can understand when you're doing that with air pressure around you, you can see that there'd be a huge, the pressure of the air is going to create resistance to you pulling, because you have nothing, no air pressure on the other side, so the air pressure is going to be complete in terms of you'll realize the full air pressure, whatever it is, 40 pounds per square inch or something. But that doesn't seem like much, in terms of, well, it might be 80 pounds in this experiment, right? It might be 200 pounds if you add it all up on that cylinder this big. So if you added up all the air pressure for the total surface area of the cylinder you're pulling, it might be 200 pounds of pressure so you're lifting 200 pounds just to pull a few inches. But in theory, you're thinking, well, in space, okay, if you get rid of this air pressure problem and you pull the cylinder out, what should stop? There shouldn't be any resistance at all. So the only resistance should be whatever magnetic connection this surface has with this surface, and any resistance or friction on the sides where the metal, it's attracted to the metal. But beyond that, you should be able to pull it, and space, empty space, should be able to fill this space going right through the metal. I mean, the metal shouldn't be an obstacle to empty space getting in the chamber. So in a sense, in a vacuum pump should move freely almost, because the space is going to come right through all the atoms and fill the chamber. So you're not going to have any problem filling it with empty space. Now, filling it with particles like electrons and protons is going to be harder, because they'd have to get through the atoms, and there's going to be some resistance. The atoms are going to say, I don't want these things flying through me. So there's going to be some repulsion takes place and some resistance to that happening. But space itself should be able to fill the void easily. So whatever tension there would be on that piston would be entirely just electrical forces, forces that are binding the metal to the metal in some way. And so the idea of, what I was thinking was, when you're trying to make a vacuum, so you have the pump, trying to empty the cylinder, and it just keeps emptying the cylinder, and then you have the tube that goes to the space you're emptying. Alright, so this is the vacuum you're trying to create. So you're basically just saying, okay, there's action in here, lots of stuff banging into each other, and there's very little action in here. And so you're basically just pulling the heat, so to speak, out, because this stuff isn't being really pulled. In essence, it's just saying we're under high pressure here, and it's going to go to the low pressure here. So there's no extra space in here. The people are crowded, and they're just like flying out of the subway door, just saying, let me out of here, it's too crowded in here. So it's just a relative argument. You create a less crowded space, the things in the crowded space will just tend to fall out of the crowded space as long as there's a space right next to it that's not crowded. And but how uncrowded can you make the space? Because there's a point you reach where there just isn't enough, the atoms are far enough apart and they bang into each other infrequently enough that even when you have this door open and they can fly into this empty space, they just don't do it very often because they're not all that harassed. And so that's the strongest your vacuum can be, is whatever the rate of temperature hostility is in this area. So that's so there's this huge connection between temperature and a vacuum. So most vacuums are sort of described as some sort of Kelvin thing, some sort of cold place, for a good reason. And so, but thinking about electrons, what would an electron do if you put it in a quiet space? I mean, it's going to say it doesn't like the other electrons, so they're going to find as much distance as possible from each other and fill the space. So they're going to evenly fill the space. Whatever space electrons are in, they're going to evenly fill it and try to keep all these distances equal. So every electron will be the same distance from every other electron. But at the same time, there's protons in the walls of their container. So there might not be a ton of, or there might not be any free protons. But the ones in the atoms of the container are real, and protons are this isn't a hard theory or anything. There's some evidence that protons are substantially larger than electrons, and they're calculated to have the same charge, but charge isn't a measure of charge density. It's just a measure of how much charge you're creating. It's like not the volume or the spread of your charge, it's the strength of your charge. So the bigger protons spread charge further than electrons. It would be my argument. And that larger spread just means the charge of the protons is stronger than the charge of the electrons. In practical fact, it goes deeper, and that it travels further. So these electrons are all going to be also attempting, as individuals, to try to get as close to these protons as they can. So there's a very interesting duality to their purpose. So they have one primary, they have two prime objectives, to use Star Trek rhetoric. They have two prime objectives. One is to get as far away from the other electrons as possible, and the other is to get as close to a proton as possible. So any electron that's, so that you got the circumstance where there'd be an electron that's close to this proton and close to this proton, and the only thing that stops it from getting closer is the fact that there's some electron in these positions that are repelling it. So there's these balance of forces. So it's being repelled by these three electrons, and it's being attracted by these two, and this is the position it settles on. And this other one is saying, well, I want to get closer to this proton, but this electron is in my way, and so I can't get there without taking some arced path, and if I take an arced path, then I end up way too close to this electron. So it's a whole balance of tension that's created in a void. So by just accident, I've basically drawn a kind of slit experiment in the sense that we have a material exterior, and we have an interior, and clearly the substance of this exterior is going to influence how the stuff on this interior is arranged, because the protons on the on the exterior in the substance are clearly going to influence how the electrons arrange themselves in that empty space. So that's mostly what I wanted to go through a little. Is that gets the idea of what a real vacuum is, or how you actually can create one. It's kind of impossible to create one without having a perfect vacuum, to create a perfect vacuum, unless you have a perfect vacuum to connect to it. And if you had a perfect vacuum to connect to it, you would pollute your perfect vacuum as much as you're improving one vacuum. You'll be you'll be ruining the other vacuum. So it's sort of an infinite, snake eating its tail thing, where you'd have to keep making the perfect one and then remake the perfect one, then remake the perfect one, to keep trying to pull the imperfections out of the other vacuum. So that's why it's kind of an impossible to make the perfect vacuum. Yeah, mostly. Alright, so maybe we'll do some comments and call this a video. I thought there was some other little subject I wanted to get to. Let's see if there's anything else I wanted to say on the Miles Mathis thing. So, yeah, like I said, it's just this idea of making new particles that interact with photons. You have to demonstrate that somewhere. And the dissident science guy, to say charge is arbitrary when there's evidence of it all over the place. I mean, I can just, I could take a piece of styrofoam and rub it on my sweater and stick it to stuff. How does your G1 theory explain that? How do you explain how stuff that's usually repugnant to each other or indifferent to each other is attracted to each other merely by rubbing some electrons on or off? And he doesn't think electrons are electrons. He thinks they're the same as photons in some way. And I have a similar theory in the sense I don't think electrons are made out of something different than force, but they're in such a different arrangement. Matter is fundamentally different than force, and he doesn't explain any of that. He just calls everything the same, and they're not the same because we wouldn't be calling them electrons if they behaved like a photon. I can't make any sense out of it. Alright. Really, if you're gonna, in my opinion, anybody out there who's thinking about doing a unification theory or a theory of any kind of physics, charge is really important. You just can't say charge is erroneous or arbitrary or they just made it up. Charge is a description of a ton of experiments. The word charge comes from a whole bunch of experiments that demonstrate an actual functional event that happens. The attraction and repulsion that happens. And you have to explain how whatever mechanism you're using, you have to explain how it can tell the difference. And I've done that with the polarization argument. But you have to have an argument. You have to have some explanation for how this pen knows not to stick, and if I charge it, it'll know to stick. You have to explain what's different between the pen that sticks and the pen that doesn't. Anyway, yeah, that's enough. Yeah, I guess I wanted to I sort of made the general speech about how there's two parts to this argument, as I've said before. There's defending my more rational theory, and then there's the pointing out how the current theory is incredibly flawed, practically almost silly, and in need of radical improvement. Alright, so we'll find some comments. There hasn't been many, and they're just stupid, so you could probably skip this part of the video because the commenters are just quite useless. Sorry to say, but yes, they perform no useful function. Kind of like a holiday. And we slide this over. Mouse, come on, mouse. That's good enough, I think. Alright. Let's see. You have explained a single dimension of your three-dimensional resonance experiment. Melissa, I mean, like the girls, but I mean, that's like a girl comment. What? You're being a little cliche. You have explained a single dimension of your three-dimensional resonance experiment. What could that possibly be talking about? Well, how could that mean anything? I mean, that's on the last video. I mean, there was just nothing in that video about resonance. The only thing stated is that photons are a single-dimensional object in the universe, and matter is a three-dimensional object in the sense that it has force in all of the vectors, all the possible vectors. It has force emanating in all the possible vectors. So anyway, I just don't know what that means, so thank you, but no thank you. Alright, Dream Drops. Not a very encouraging title for not a very good username. This is sort of sad. I see this as part of devolution. You're calling everyone wrong where you're in the position to prove yourself equally a thorough. Sorry, it's not a very good sentence. I don't know what that means. You call nanotechnology and quantum technology the same things. Well, no, I don't. I make the accusation that there'll never be any quantum technology. That all there'll be is small technology, manipulating electrons and protons and neutrons. But they're never going to do this quantum entanglement crap or qubits and all of that quantum computing shit based on this silly notion that you can jump to the future and get the answer. That kind of nonsense is nonsense, and it'll never be realized in any way whatsoever. The same things and claim that engineers and physicists can't describe what they are doing. Well, clearly they can't. They call something like a positron, and then they call something, I think they have an actual device called a positronic scanner or something for medical purposes. No, they call it something else, like it actually shoots the stuff. And that's not what it's doing. It's irradiating things, and the radiation causes the atoms to essentially ionize. And they're just reading the ionization, and and because they're reading ionization that where the electrons aren't as stable as a normal electron, let's say, in terms of its charge, they're assuming it's some sort of positron. But it's not a positron emission. It doesn't emit positrons. It causes positrons to be formed in the body, but they're not really positrons. They're electrons. It's just an ionizer. It's just a frickin' ionizer. See, but it's a machine doing one thing, and they've described it excessively. They've exaggerated the description. I mean, they could have called it a antiparticle emission, what do they call it? Resolution device or something. They could give it any kind of silly name. But the idea that they're implying that they're emitting some kind of real particle, when that's not what they're doing. They don't emit positrons. Alright, that their quantum technology is either fake, broken, or misrepresented. There you go, that's the word. Yes, a huge amount of misrepresentations, a bunch of propagandist kind of rhetoric and titles, like Hothladay, a bunch of insane exaggerations, saying things that aren't true, okay, they'd like it to be true, but it isn't, and it's, calling all this stuff quantum that isn't really quantum. There's a ton of things called quantum that really is just nano. There's a ton of stuff like that. Everything small they call a quantum now, and you haven't seen that in the real world. It's a real thing. Okay, that the technology doesn't have anything to do with Heisenberg or Huygens or any kind of true quantum wave function technology. It's just small technology, and they call it quantum because nano doesn't sound as cool. You don't realize that's a real thing happening in the world. Then you make these ad nauseum videos, circular using an argument, and you write crappy sentences over and over, redundantly poorly formed sentences. Whatever. Ad nauseum videos, circular using an argument of no qualitative weight. So again, I go the trouble to draw diagrams of it, explain how polarization explains how you can magnify a force by segregating it, segregating the left and the right, and the punch becomes harder of the force because of that segregation, because it's not scattered anymore, it's directed one way. Like if I was to explain it like, well, here you could spread your punch over all these vectors and it would only have the value, it'd be very, only 10 pounds per square inch across that whole vector. But if you could turn into a laser punch, and go one way, it would have 10,000 pounds per square inch of pressure. Some simple explanation. You think that's redundant and useless. I think you're redundant and useless. I think you're just a common dumbass. Okay, just saying stupid crap that's completely unrelated to anything specifically argued in the video you're responding to, you dumb fuck. The video you're responding to, I think it's a Tesla video, is describing how Tesla, okay, lived to be 90-something years old, or whatever, 87, and, he has, go ahead, tie 3 paragraphs of Tesla together somewhere. Show me the 3 best paragraphs that ever were emanated from Tesla as logic. And I'm challenging you to do it, because I don't think you can find 3 rational paragraphs. He lived 87 years, and he didn't write 3 rational paragraphs, or be quoted as saying 3 rational paragraphs. And you think he's the greatest brilliant mind in all of human history. I think he's a preposterously exaggerated crank. But whatever. Alright, then you make these ad nauseum views, circular argument. I understand that not everything needs math, and even in physics you can describe models without math. And again, this argument that I have something against math, when I just keep talking about Maxwell, I keep talking about the inverse square law, I don't have anything against math. I have something against the premises that happened before the math. The Huygens, the Heisenberg. You don't understand. Where do they get the sine theta for their math in the 2-slit experiment? They get it from the silly notion that in the single slit experiment there's 2 point sources inside the experiment. There's 2. And then in the double slit experiment, no, there's only 1 point source inside each slit. I'm arguing their premises, not their math, you assholes. But just keep pretending this is about me being some crank against mathematics. No, I'm cranking against silly notions that there's somehow a bent space factor in Einstein's math. Because there isn't. Shit. There's the inverse square law converted by Lorentz. Transformed by Lorentz. There's nothing else in it. There's no magical bent space element. And even in the physics, you can describe models without math using 100% proof. You can describe models without math, leading to a 100% proof. Certainly a model that covers everything, like I can make a model of a car, okay, a small one, and I can show how it works, and then you can make the big one. So yeah, you could even model atmospheres. Like you can create a wind tunnel, and then you can run things in the wind tunnel, and you can see the effects and sort of prove theories about what wind does, because you've synthesized wind. You've created a model in the sense that you're modeling an environment that is in chaos in the real world, and you can control it in your little world. And that's a huge advantage. It's not the same as modeling. It's purifying. It's closing a system. So you can take out all the external variables that might be screwing up your results, and you can clean it. So you can create a clean environment to do an experiment. Controls. Alright, however, I find this all to be incredibly thin. Well, I find theories about bent space and particle dualities and entanglement. I find the evidence to be insanely thin. It's not only has every appearance of invisible man made up crap like dark matter. It's intuitively nonsensical. Photons are in 2 wave configurations. What are you talking? How they do all of that? How do they behave more complicated than my cat? How does a fucking photon have more complex behavior than my fucking cat? Anyway, do you, who takes determinism seriously, expect for this go, then go anywhere? Again, you couldn't be bothered to read what you're typing? I mean, yes, okay, you're some kind of foreigner. Okay, so yeah, you don't know how to do English. Then you could be less arrogant, because no one's going to be able to read what you wrote, so you should say in the first sentence, I write badly, and most of what I'm going to say won't sound right. I get it, you can't finance a lab, but you can get calculus ebooks. Again, why do I need calculus to make a model? I don't need calculus to make a model. I don't need to know exactly where Mercury is going to be to the millisecond or the millifoot. I don't have any need for that information, and that's all calculus is good for, is knowing very specific and very detailed information about something. I don't need details to make a model. I don't need to, like if I'm going to make a model of a car, I don't need to put little flares on the fenders, and the headlights don't really have to work, and the grill work can be made out of spaghetti. It just doesn't fucking matter. I can make a perfectly functional model that proves, what's the words used? Proves theory without having to waste my time with calculus, for fuck's sake. One way or another for free. Yeah, so I should waste my time learning how to do timed equations, averaging, where I don't think I'd have any use for it in model building. But anyway, you can try making, qualitative counter arguments. I've clearly already made them. None of you assholes have made any kind of excuse. Why isn't the double slit pattern what the mathematics says it should be in photons? Direct question. Why? Why are all the gravitational lensing images missing anything like a lens flare? A single sun passes close into the lens and creates a giant blob of light in the lens. How come there are absolutely no images like that in all of these huge, hundreds of thousands of light year across lenses, gigantic lenses, and not one blob of light? Not one. Why? How is it possible the theory is correct if that phenomenon doesn't exist? How do the laws of averages make it rational for you to believe that theory is correct when that evidence is missing? Let's see. I made a ton of counter arguments. How is it possible for the half-silvered mirror not to diffract light when the light goes through it? How is the half-silvered mirror not exactly like a diffraction gradient, which is exactly like a multi-slit experiment? How is it possible that the interferometer isn't diverging the light? These are direct fucking questions for which you will not provide an answer, and yet you say you can try making qualitative counter arguments. I haven't tried, I've succeeded in making quality counter arguments to the bogus bullshit you idiots are fucking glued to. If things are wrong as you say, then you should be able to mathematically. So again, the math isn't going to fix the two-slit experiment. New math isn't going to fix it. The absence of Huygens is going to fix it. The absence of Heisenberg nonsense is going to fix it. It's the premises that are broken. The inverse square law is not broken. Einstein's silly interpretation of it, that is making it into a gravity well, that's the broken part, idiot. The cause, what they think is causing the inverse square law. Einstein sold you a bill of goods where a magical bending of space is some sort of spandex and you can somehow bend it and the stuff will somehow fall into the fucking well. He sold you bullshit as an explanation for why there's an inverse square law, you dumbass. It has nothing to do with fucking math. It has to do with how you fucking declare the variables in the math. The formulas aren't broken. The fucking assumptions that go into the formulas are broken. Fucking you're just all lying sacks of shit to keep obsessing about some protest I'm making against mathematics, which I'm not doing. Fuck. Mathematically represent your arguments, even algebraically. Well, I have done that with geometry, shithead. You don't think I've brought up the subject of fucking algebra and pointing out that, I mean, I just did it in this last video, pointing out how the electrons find an even pressure. And don't you think that if they're all finding, if I take 10 points of just 10 dots in space and I say the rule is they have to have even pressure between them, don't you think that's going to create geometry, you dumb fuck? God damn it. Do you pay any attention to these videos you comment on? Do you really pay any attention whatsoever? Oh, fuck. If you can't do that, no, I've already done that, you're not going to get too far with this and might fade into obscurity. No, I'm going to be anointed as the fucking god of physics, asshole, because I have unified it. I've done everything you fucktards couldn't do for thousands of years. You've been sitting there saying, how does that happen? How do magnets stick to each other? How do magnets stick to each other? How do magnets stick to each other? And I answered the fucking question, you jerk! You're just such dumb fucking cunts. Say the same fucking idiotic bullshit over and over. I have no fucking issue with my confidence in the evidence I've already described, how my theory answers questions you don't even come close to answering. Not even close. And I'm slam fucking dunking it. I obviously know how to play basketball better than you. Oh, fuck. Physics prove more applicable and real than yours. So what's he saying? So let's see. You'll fade into obscuria as advancements. So he says with this paradigm, the paradigm of what? Dark matter, your unicorn entanglement bullshit, your quantum qubit nonsense of jumping to the future, your faster than light travel nonsense, your fucking holographic silly putty. You're not going anywhere with that crap. You should be going to the fucking, go back to fucking kindergarten and learn the basics, about how, round wheels don't work as well as, square wheels don't work as well as round ones. You're not even getting basic shit right here. You can't even figure out when somebody's selling you a fucking goddamn UFO theory. Alright, no offense to you. Fuck you! Offense taken, cunt. Alright, another offensive asshole. Evan S. So it's 3 idiotic comments. Let's see. Poor guy, I'm so sorry for you for believing government propaganda. So, another Tesla nut. Bro. Let's see what I'll call him. Call him, Dickless. Hey, Dickless. Are you smoking crack during the video? I don't know. So what? You have to be on crack to point out something like, you know, Tesla didn't write shit. For a scientist, he didn't say much. Didn't leave much of a legacy behind. Like, absolutely none. He wrote a little narrative about his little life story and how he watched his mother, you know, make washing machines out of toasters, and because mommy believed in God, he thinks it must be a good idea because his mommy doesn't believe in things that aren't true. He wasn't a fucking god of science. Shit. LOL. Yeah, everyone takes this guy seriously on this, please. Yeah, so again, and your evidence defending Tesla is where? Where do I go on the internet to find the monument of logic and reasoning that is Tesla? Why don't you go direct me to the place where the brilliance of Tesla is just made so fucking obvious, with a ton of evidence of the Tesla successes. The fucking ray gun. Oh man. Look the other direction. You're going the wrong way. Yeah, right. Sure. Fuck you. I just hate these people. Alright, so Darla. No, it's good to see the women participating. What? Question mark. Wow, I had no idea you did this channel. Yes, she's, I guess, an Amendum viewer, and she's fallen upon the you know, the other project. Anyway, okay, so this Expose UK. Gary, you seem to be misinterpreted my comment. No, there was nothing to misinterpret. I mean, some asshole in the comments, whatever his name is, asshole, keeps bringing up this stupid Which Way experiment that's based on the premise of a crystal that creates entangled photons, and then somehow two different pairs of entangled photons, one traveling to the doing the interference pattern, and the others entangled photons going to the I'm watching you section, you know, with a bunch of beam splitters and mirrors and bullshit. And I'm supposed to dissect that experiment to prove the truth, rather than just go right to the two-slit experiment and say, let's just keep it simple, stupid. So let's try to explain what happens in the simple experiment, not what happens in the complex experiment where there's a ton of assumptions that the two photons are created instantaneously with each other, like at the same exact moment, so they'd have exactly the same phase. A bunch of assumptions based on what mechanical theory of photon creation. Physics doesn't even have a rational theory of photon creation, which I have, which should be my next video. I'll have to write that down. Photon video. Because I have a theory that actually explains how photons are created, how their wavelength is created. Physics doesn't. Alright, I don't trust them with these experiments. Again, I don't trust anyone. The point is you're just piling on with a conversation that somehow this is the real intriguing experiment. This complex, full of assumptions experiment is somehow where the real physics is. And I'm saying, no, the real physics is in the two-slit. The real physics is all the way back at Newton with a single aperture. Until you explain this, all the rest of it is bullshit. This is the game. You don't need it any more. You don't need it any more than this. This pinhole. That's it. A fucking pinhole. That's the experiment, shithead. You know, putting a whole bunch of dresses around it and a bunch of mannequins and a bunch of silly shit. That's not going to make you understand what's happening with that aperture any better. Maybe putting the pinhole underwater might help. Maybe putting the pinhole in space might help. But taking your fancy bullshit apparatus with your fancy crystals and your bullshit explanations and your not even accurate drawings aren't going to make physics more coherent. And it's certainly not a good use of my time to sit there and research first, spend how much time am I supposed to spend to get up to speed on all of the chemistry that's probably involved in what's happening inside that crystal and what actually is coming out of it. I should waste a month? And as I've already pointed out, the whole theory of a beam splitter is bullshit, in the sense that there is no beam splitter that creates two identical beams of light. That going through the splitter and reflecting off the splitter are two different functional events, and the two beams won't be in the same condition after they've had those different interactions. I've already demonstrated that, all right? And so the experiment has it as an assumption. Oh, fuck. I was simply asking, why do they say these things if it isn't true? Why do they say there's an entangled photon? Why do they, because it's fun. They're doing the experiment to advance quantum mechanics. They're completely caught up in the thrill of the whole fantasy project of the whole nothing's real in the universe and everything's just a perturbation in the ether. That's their fucking passion. That's why they lie. That's why they totally exaggerate. That's why they make a claim that this photon and this photon are somehow magically communicating, but not in any way that we could ever figure out. Which doesn't make any sense. If they're communicating, we can figure it out. There's no way they can do it in secret. The photons, they don't even move fancier than my cat. They have ESP that my cat doesn't even fucking have. Anyway, if it's true that with the quantum, let's see. I'm asking, why do they say these things if it isn't true? And what is the quantum eraser experiment if it isn't a, they say, let alone the apparent experiment that proves Bell's inequality? So again, we're back to Bell and the fucking polarizing films. So again, this is just such a crock of fucking shit. They've never even proved that polarizing films are 50-50. Do you understand? If you're using these polarizers as part of your experiment and you go into the experiment with the assumption that 50% of the light is blocked this way and 50% of the light's blocked that way, and it's not true, that yes, the Bell inequalities will be violated. Duh! Fuck. And quantum entanglement debunked Einstein's spooky action at a distance. It didn't debunk anything. There is no fucking entanglement to evidence. You're just saying, you're saying that you don't understand that they exaggerate the evidence that supports their theory, that they pretend they have evidence, like with the Eddington thing. The evidence is incredibly weak, and yet they write New York headlines, Einstein proved right, when that wasn't what really happened. Not even close to being the thing that really happened. And it certainly didn't prove relativity right. Even if light was bent by gravity, it certainly doesn't prove all the other bullshit that Einstein made up. I'm not trying to argue their point of view. I'm politely, you're not politely doing shit, trying to ask for yours. That wasn't what your comment was. Your comment was, Gary, waste a bunch of time analyzing this preposterously complex experiment that has all these 900 assumptions built into it, so you don't get anything done. So you go waste your time, tearing down. I explained it. Even if I defeat that experiment, then all I've done is cut the small toe off of quantum mechanics. If I want to kill quantum mechanics, I go for the fucking two-slit experiment. That's its foundation. That's where all this bullshit started. I said the exact words. That's when science put its fucking head up its fucking ass. Okay, was with Bohr and that fucking experiment. That's when the whoop-de-doers, the woo-woo religious kooks like Bohr, took over physics. That's its heart. If I can break that, if I can break your fucking interferometer, all your interference wavy bullshit, if I can kill that nonsense, I win. Killing your stupid entanglement experiment doesn't make a victory for me, because that's so far out on a fucking loop-de-doo limb, alright, I'll gain nothing. Dumb cunt. Okay. Let's see, I don't think there's no energy in matter other than that received from the environment. I guess that's a quote of me. No, that's from Tesla. Okay, there's no energy in matter other than that received from the environment. does that even make sense? I mean, theoretically, how would Tesla know how matter was created? Clearly, there's energy in matter. So, I mean, Tesla said lots of shit, and then the nuclear bomb went off, and Tesla had to shut his mouth because, yeah, I guess Einstein was right. There's a ton of energy inside of matter. Such statements from Tesla and his contemporaries in the period of 1900 to 1939 points to the ether science they were practicing. How so? How so does saying this stupid thing, there's no energy in matter other than that received from the environment? How does that demonstrate any ether theory to be true? How? This ether science and Tesla's Steinmetz type is the real subject. The real subject, if you want to talk about cartoon characters. This ether science preceded and is opposed to Einsteinian curved space. Yes, I'm opposed to curved space, but ether is just as stupid as curved space. It's just as much of a God theory. Instead of explaining why things happen, you just blame an ether. It's the same God of the Gap bullshit. And modern QM, both of them. Whatever. This ether science is more advanced. No, it's more vacuous as an explanation. It's nothing as an explanation for a phenomenon. And again, it doesn't explain. Ether doesn't explain where the energy come from to move the earth towards the sun. Your ether perturbation theory doesn't explain any of that jack for ass. Let's see if this is worth keep reading. The ether science is more advanced, is backed by a better math. What is more scientific and is being used around the clock behind the scenes by the rich and powerful? So he thinks Donald Trump got rich, not because he inherited a big pile of money from his daddy, but because he has special Tesla powers. He lost more money than he made. If he would have just put all of Daddy's money into would have just left it in the properties that his daddy gave him and collected rent, he would have been richer than he is now. Just by compound interest and the increased value in real estate. So his Tesla powers didn't work for him, asshole. Anyway. You people are just so fucking stupid. Who can draw as much energy as they need straight from the ether? Oh, okay. Now we're done reading. You, sir, are a lunafucking-tick. An insane lunatic. You should go to a doctor and start talking about this theory of rich people having Tesla powers, and the doctor will maybe give you some sort of scan and see if you have a tumor or something, or maybe you ate too much lead as a kid and you got a bunch of lead brain problem, but your brain is douched. Okay, you got douche for brain. Try again. I mean, don't try again. Alright, so the cunt, Chimmermini, he was probably done here. It doesn't matter what you think of the explanations for the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment. So it doesn't matter that, in my opinion, they've never proved they ever created an entangled photon ever in the history of the universe. The fact is the detection happens on the path after the slit. So again, he's still claiming the whole useful function of the experiment is the idea of the entangled particles, and without the entangled particles there's no measurement in the device, you retard. So how can they detect something if the thing doing the detecting isn't happening, asshole? God, you're so fucking done. Hence it cannot be a local phenomenon you claim it to be. So you claim, because you know exactly, that the crystal's actually creating something called an entangled photon. So, evidence, after numerous complaints that people never argue about experimental evidence. What numerous complaints? I'm talking about doing reasonable experiments based on things that we don't have to accept Copenhagen interpretations or many world explanations. Again, how does your experiment create a straighter line to the truth? by creating a more convoluted experiment. You think putting more variables into the experiment is going to make it more, you're going to be more capable of getting to the truth? They can't accurately describe the double slit experiment. They can't, all these professors and all these talking science heads, all these physicists, they can't accurately describe the simplest experiment in physics, and yet you trust them to tell you what's happening in this eraser experiment. You're just such a fucking cunt. Alright, so I think we're done. I don't know why this asshole even... Superior Mind, I don't even know why he commented to this douchebag. Got to stop there. An asteroid rotates. In my analogy, I wasn't worried about any rotation. And rotation wouldn't be a wave, idiot. Which is a wave, he says. A frequency. Oscillation. The dark side of the moon. Quadrophonically. So again, I just use a simple analogy of how, you know, an asteroid flies through space and can bang into stuff. And no, I used it as the Earth and Mars, and I send an asteroid in between them. Whether the asteroid's rotating or not isn't going to change what I said happens, which is the asteroid is deflected by the gravity of the bodies. So you know, it's like these people, they don't even pay fucking attention to the fucking subject of the fucking video. I hate your fucking cunt guts. That's it. That's enough. Alright. So, till the next time and such.